Hi, everybody. Welcome to this short session on job crafting. Tim Baker's my name. Look forward to working with you. And we're only going to be here for just about 30 minutes. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview, and it comes out of my latest book, Breaking the Proactive Paradox. So let me share my screen and we'll get stuck into the presentation. Okay, so a little bit about me, and I know some of you are sort of regular participants, so you probably get sick of this introduction, but for those who don't know me, Tim Baker's my name, as I say. I write books. I'm up to book number 11. I present at workshops, I give keynote addresses, I do executive coaching, and I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition in Brisbane. Every second week we play because it takes that long to recover at my age. So there we go. All right, a little bit about the topic. Now, one of the key objections that I anticipate is this, that how can we redesign a job that actually increases performance? In other words, is there actually a connection between the job and performance? And just by moving the deck chairs, do we actually increase performance? Now, my argument is, yes, that's very possible by using what we call job crafting. And I've seen evidence of that. And in fact, I've seen research that demonstrates that that can happen. And I'll give you a couple of examples as we go through that today. So the answer to that question is yes. But of course, what we use is the concept of job specification. Now, job specification's been around for 100 years, since the Industrial Revolution. And the whole purpose of job specification is to chop the organization up into bite-sized pieces and give everyone a piece of the action, which of course is a job. Problem with that, of course, is it's so tightly wound, so completely controlled, that it becomes very difficult for that person to be able to think outside the square when they need to. And of course, more and more people need to do that. So that's the impediment that's in the way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the proactive paradox, because that gives us a little insight into why people aren't as perhaps proactive as they should be. Then, of course, we'll spend the majority of time talking about concept of job crafting. And at the end, I've got a special offer for you that you might like to take advantage of. So we've all heard of the word paradox, and we use it regularly. It's perhaps an overused word, and the best way I can describe a paradox is the chicken and the egg. Which comes first? Does the chicken come first, or does the egg come first? And so it's a bit of a paradox as to which comes first. And the proactive paradox is a similar kind of concept that I want to talk about very briefly. So let's have a look at the proactive paradox. Now, it's a simple process, and it works like this. What happens initially is that when you inherit a team, any team, you probably want people to show their initiative. You want people to use their independent judgment. So you really have the idea that you want that to happen. But also the team members that you inherit probably want to show their independent judgment as well. So you want people to show their independent judgment, and the team or the individuals in the team want to show independent judgment. So basically everybody's on the same page to begin with. And then what happens is that you invite people to show initiative. So perhaps you have a team meeting, you get everyone together and you explain to people that you actually want people to show autonomy and independent judgment at the right place, at the right time, in the right way, that you want people to do that. You're encouraging people to do that. So you make that announcement in the team meeting, and everybody sits there very quietly and they're listening to you. But they're not telling you this, but what they might be thinking in their mind is, I'm not sure that Fred or Mary really believes that, because Fred and Mary like to get involved in things, and I'm not really convinced that they believe that we should be showing independent judgment. So what happens, of course, is nothing happens. And you notice that nothing happens after you make that announcement in the team meeting. And ultimately, because nothing happens, you feel this need as the team leader to jump in and fill the void. In other words, you do get in and do the work, but your justification in doing the work is really that nobody else is doing it. So if I don't do it, it won't get done. So that's your justification for that. But of course, the team members are sitting there thinking to themselves, aha, I knew Fred or Mary wasn't really interested in me being autonomous and showing independent judgment, because if Fred or Mary was serious about that, they wouldn't have got involved in all of these activities. So what happens is one's waiting for the other. It's a bit like the chicken and the egg, what comes first? And of course, it confirms in the mind of the team holder that you don't really want people to show independent judgment. And so we get to a situation where it creates a stalemate. You get frustrated with people because they're not showing independent judgment, and they get frustrated with you because they don't think that you want them to show independent judgment. So you can see how that can be a problem. And of course, it's a problem around miscommunication more than anything else. And actually, there are three key stages in this process. The first stage is agreement. That is, you want people to be autonomous and they want to act in an autonomous way. So both are on the same page. Then there's skepticism, because the team see you jumping in and doing things that you know the other team members should be doing, but you do it anyway. So they get skeptical about that. And in their mind, it confirms that you don't really want people to show their initiative, you see. So it becomes a little bit of a paradox, and that becomes problematic. So my book, Breaking the Proactive Paradox, talks about that in great detail with a lot of examples. Okay, so let's look at an example. Let's look at an example of job crafting, because job crafting is one way of breaking this proactive paradox. So let's think about this for a minute, and I'll just read this through so you can understand what I'm saying here. So Paul works in IT and customer support. He spends most of his time on a helpline, but he really has a passion for testing and improving new software. So through discussion with his manager, Paul joins a group that tests new applications before they're launched in the company. This took up about 3 hours every month. While Paul's role didn't substantially change through job crafting, he was delighted that his skill and passion for analysis of new applications was being recognized. So a small tweak like that is actually what we call job crafting. So we all job craft, whether we realize it or not. So when you come into a job, what happens, of course, is you gravitate to the things that you enjoy doing. It's human nature. And you perhaps not so much avoid, but you probably spend less time doing the things that you don't enjoy. And so what that means is that after 2 years in the job that you have inherited has actually changed from the time you started to the time you finished. And you don't even realize it, because you certainly gravitate to the things that you enjoy. So we all job craft subconsciously anyway. Now that's human nature, isn't it? We all spend time on things we enjoy more, and we usually spend less time on the things we don't enjoy. So what I'm suggesting is, why don't we do this deliberately? So in other words, why don't we actually have a conversation about it? And why don't we start to look at ways that we might actually be able to deliberately job craft rather than do it subconsciously? So you might say, well, what's the difference between job specification and the job description? Well, the job specification technically is really looking at the knowledge and the skills and the abilities required to do the job. So it's a bit of an analysis of the job itself. And out of that analysis, what happens is we craft a job description, which really probably goes into more detail around the duties and responsibilities that the individual has. And so that's the difference. So the job specification is the overarching narrative, if you like, of what's required for the job. And out of that, we actually create a job description. And of course, the job description is something we're all very familiar with. So what I'm suggesting is that by redesigning our job design by using job crafting, we can actually get more performance from the people that work for us. So let's talk about that a little further and consider it in a bit more detail. Now, there are basically three ways that you and I can job craft. Now, let me run through these three and consider them in relation, and I'll give you a couple more examples as well. The most common way to job craft is what we might call task crafting. Now, task crafting is either not doing tasks on the job description, doing more tasks than are identified in the job description, or modifying the tasks that are in the job description. So task crafting is the most obvious place to start. So for example, if, as you saw before, the example of the IT example, that would be an example of task crafting. So what's happening there is Paul has decided to engage in a little bit more work around the technical aspect of his job. His job essentially is around dealing with customers, and he's very good at it. He can talk the technical lingo and do that in basic language so that the individual knows what is required. But really, his real love is the technical aspects of the work. And so by talking to his manager, he was able to inject himself into a meeting once every now and again to learn a little bit about that. So task crafting is the obvious place to start job crafting, but it's not the only place. Now, there are two other interesting concepts around job crafting. The second one on the right-hand side is what we might call relational crafting. Now, relational crafting is where we recraft or redesign the relationships that we deal with in doing the job. So obviously, as we all know, in any job, you've got a number of stakeholders that you deal with, both internally and perhaps externally, and you deal with them from time to time when you need to get something done. So relational crafting, and I'll give you an example of that shortly, but relational crafting is where we start to develop new relationships with different stakeholders, or perhaps strengthen or improve the current relationships we have with stakeholders. So it's about recrafting our job around relationships rather than the task themselves. Now, by doing that, of course, the whole idea is to improve the quality of the product or the service that we're actually producing. Now, the other type of job crafting is what we might call cognitive crafting. Now, cognitive crafting is really thinking differently about your job, having a different kind of concept about what the job entails. So if you see your work, of course, as a very boring set of tasks that have to be done, well, of course, your energy level is going to be pretty low. But of course, if you considered the value of those tasks in the context of the end user, you can get a new appreciation of what that job looks like. So I'll give you an example of that as well. But essentially, what I'm saying here is that you've basically got three different ways of being able to craft in your work. And of course, some things actually cover more than one type or one dimension of job crafting. So let's have a look at another example. Let's have a look at Harry. Now, Harry is a bus driver, and he decides to give helpful sightseeing advice while traveling his regular route from the airport to the city. So his job is to take passengers who've just arrived from another state or perhaps country, and on the way to the motel or wherever he's dropping them off, he decides that he's going to give some sightseeing tips up the front of the bus. So he's mindful that many of his passengers are from out of town. So Harry perceives his job as more than just driving a bus. Now, that's cognitive crafting. So he sees himself as a person who can provide quality information to newly arrived people. So he uses his extensive local knowledge, and Harry decides to use his extroverted personality to good effect. He decides to add sightseeing to his primary task of driving a bus. You see, that's a simple little addition. And because Harry doesn't see himself as a bus driver, he sees himself as a person who has a lot of useful information that he can share with his customers. He's decided to add to his tasks the idea of giving useful information about some of the sites along the way from the airport. So this is an example of both task crafting and cognitive crafting. And of course, he wouldn't be doing the new task if he didn't see his job in the right light. So there's a very good example of task and cognitive crafting together. Now, I should point out that job crafting is not something that's necessarily applicable to everybody, although I think in all cases, it's quite possible to job craft. But I would say that these groups who I would say have special employment needs are probably people that will benefit most from job crafting. So, for example, your older employees, the people who are close to retirement. Now, think about them for a minute. They have enormous experience. They probably have a whole bunch of tacit knowledge that other people don't have. And because they have those things, they're able to share that. Now, if an astute manager notices this, they might sit down with one of those older workers and start to look at how they could craft their job by suggesting to that older employee that they could act as a mentor for some younger employees. And of course, most people are quite happy to share their knowledge and experience with other people. So, of course, not everyone might want to do that, but the point is that's an opportunity for job crafting with very experienced people who are in the workplace coming towards the twilight of their career. Another one might be, of course, employees with disabilities or health problems. So people with disabilities or health problems, of course, have their own challenges that they need to deal with. And they might be given a generic job description to do. And it's quite obvious that there's going to be some difficulties in them executing that job exactly according to the job description. So the manager might sit down with those individuals and start to craft their job to better suit their limitations in regard to their disabilities or health problems. And so obviously that group would be very open and conducive to the concept of job crafting. Now, something that many of us have experienced in our own working life is that when we have a young family, young children, obviously that creates enormous pressure on the work-life balance situation. And when we have to look after children at home, young children, we sometimes find it difficult to be able to execute the generic duties and responsibilities on the job, in the job description. So, for example, and particularly for female employees. So instead of maybe a transit between taking maternity leave and, or perhaps coming back from maternity leave even, the manager might sit down with the parents of young children and start to look at how they can make their job a little bit more compatible to their own work-life challenges. And so there's three very key, very simple examples of groups of people with special employment needs who would benefit enormously from job crafting. Of course, that's not only to those people. There are many, everybody's got their own particular challenges. So job crafting is open to everyone, basically. That's how it works. Here's another example of job crafting that you might be interested in. This comes out of my book, Breaking the Proactive Paradox. So you've got Marilyn. Now, Marilyn is an architect who specializes in designing offices for large companies. All right, so that's her job. She goes out of her way to organize several informal meetings with clients on a new office design project. So basically, this organization is going to move into new offices, and Marilyn's job is to design the office for that organization. But during those meetings, Marilyn, instead of looking at the current office, the layout, which would be the normal thing that an architect would look at, she observes the way people are working. So she actually watches people and sees what they do and how they interact with one another. So she has several visits, and after several visits, Marilyn changes the office designs based on her observations and interactions with the customer. So by simply looking at her job slightly differently, in other words, applying cognitive crafting, she understands that her job is to create value for this workplace. It's not just simply about designing a new office, but it's also about adding value to the work that these people do. But of course, her relational crafting comes into play too, because instead of just talking to, say, the manager, she might walk around and talk to people as they're doing their job to find out what the challenges they have in doing their job. And by observing these challenges, she can understand that these things are critically important to put into her design, so that when she actually produces the design, it's actually very conducive to the work that this office or this company does. So there's an example of relational crafting and also cognitive crafting together. So there's another example. So you can see that these examples, I'm sure you can consider those examples from your own point of view in your own workplace. Now you're probably asking or probably thinking to yourself, okay, I get all that, but how do I start? Where do I go with this? Now, obviously I go into this in great detail in my book, but ultimately there are 4 key steps. And of course, if you're interested in applying this program, a job crafting program in your organization, all you've got to do is give me a call and I'm happy to come in and we can work on this. So the very first thing you do is you need to give people training. So you need to train everyone in your workplace about what the concept of job crafting is, just like you're picking up on that today, but perhaps in a bit more detail. You need to explain to them what the benefits are. And you need to explain the benefits to the organization and the benefits to the individual as well. So basically, and it doesn't have to be a long training session, but it's got to be long enough for everybody to understand that there's something in it for them and that they understand how they might actually reshape their job to better suit their own needs or to build on their own strengths. And then the next step is that you get people to actually record their work activity. Now, I normally suggest a week, and it's a bit of a pain in the backside to do. But ultimately, what you need to do is to get some very clear data about how people are spending their time over a week. So you can draw up a little map around this. It's very easy to do. And you give people this map and you ask them to record in their intervals what they're doing during that time. And so after a week, and I say a week because let's face it, most things that happen in a person's life will happen after a week, so you don't need to do this necessarily for 2 weeks. 1 week is fine. So you don't need to go down that road. So once everyone's completed their recording activity, the next step is to reflect on that and think about what you did during the week. Because if I asked you to explain what you did for the, earlier this week, you're going to miss things, aren't you? So you actually need a recording activity to be able to do this. But then when you've done that, you need to look at it carefully and consider it from the 3 dimensions of relations. So what relationships are working, what aren't, in terms of the people you have to work with to get the job done. What tasks could be increased, what could be reduced, what tasks could be modified. So therefore we take into account the task crafting, and perhaps how might we consider our job in a different light, such as Harry, the bus driver, or Marilyn, the architect. So we actually start to ask ourselves the question, what are we here for and what value add are we providing? And then the next step is to actually sit down with the manager and to start working on some areas that are required. Now, the manager's job is not to collar people and say, you need to job craft. The job crafting component comes from the individual, the job holder. The job holder is the one that's got to initiate this, otherwise it's not going to work. But ultimately what the job holder is going to do is come to the manager and have a conversation with them about how they might job craft, considering all of the things above. And that's how it works. And you'll get some great success stories throughout your organization, and you'll find that productivity and performance will increase. People will be happier, people will be more engaged in their work, and people will have more autonomy and control over their work. And hopefully it will reduce that proactive paradox I talked about earlier on in our little session together. So that's how you do it. And as I said, if you're interested in knowing more, contact me and I'm happy to come in and we can have a conversation about how we might implement a job crafting program in your organization. Okay, so one last thing or two things before we wrap up and finish. By the way, if you've got any questions or comments that you'd like to ask me today, you can go to the chat box and type them in, or of course, come and talk to me online via my email address, which you'll receive. So at the end of this session, you'll receive a copy of two things. You'll receive a copy of the slides that you're seeing, of course, and a copy of the recording, and you'll receive that in an email that I'll be sending you out today. And in that email, you will get an opportunity or an invitation to join me next week, about the same time, 11:30 actually. So every Friday I have one of these sessions of short, sharp, to the point. And in that session, you just click on the link, and what we're going to talk about there is how you might create team purpose for clarity and focus. How do you improve the focus on your teams? This comes from a different book, which is Winning Teams, the 8 Characteristics of High-Performing Teams. So we look at creating a purpose statement there. And if you're interested in knowing how to do that, then come along at 11:30 Australian Eastern Standard Time next Friday, and we will learn the basics of that. So that invitation's open to you. And the other thing I would say is that if you liked what you saw today and you'd like to get a pre-ordered copy of my book, Breaking the Proactive Paradox, Maximizing Performance Through Empowerment, all you need to do is to send me an email by the close of business today. Now, what's in it for you? Well, the book's out around November, early November. I believe my American publishers are telling me that the book will be out then. But by pre-ordering it now, you will save yourself some money. So the recommended retail price will be $40 plus postage if you want to wait until then. Or what you can do is pay upfront now and you'll receive it for $30. I will obviously sign it for you and send it out hot off the press before anybody else actually receives a copy. So that invitation's open to you if you'd like to take advantage of that. So that's it from me, folks. So I hope that's been informative for you and it's given you a few little tips on what job crafting is all about and how it can benefit performance in the workplace. So that's about it from me. And as I said, keep your eyes peeled. Thanks, Lara. I appreciate that feedback. Keep your eyes peeled and you will receive the copy of the slides and the recording from me. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, and hopefully I get to see you next Friday. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.